We're from Fancy Tiger Crafts.
And we're going to show you how to get your craft on.
Today I'm going to show you how to finish a seam using a French seam. French seams are one of my favorite ways to finish a seam because it's really simple to achieve. You don't need a serger and it creates a very tidy, neat seam. So the first step to doing a French seam is to sew your fabrics wrong sides together. So this goes against everything you've ever been taught in sewing, but you're going to put the two fabrics that make up your seam wrong sides together so that you're looking at the right side of the fabric, and then you're going to sew them. I'm going to sew them at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to trim this seam allowance so that it's just 1/8 of an inch. So I'm just going to trim this seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch, so just trying to cut it in half. And now for the next step, you're going to need to do a little bit of math. We just did a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if your pattern calls for a 5/8 inch seam allowance, you're going to subtract that 1/4 inch and sew your next seam at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. If your pattern calls for a 1/2 inch seam allowance, subtract the 1/4 inch and you're going to do this next seam at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. For the purpose of this video, we're going to say that our pattern calls for a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So I just cut the edge off of my seam allowance. Now I'm going to flip this right sides together. And you're going to want to press this seam before sewing. So I'm going to take it over and press it. So now I have a nice pressed seam, and I'm going to sew the same edge, this time at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. There's my 3/8 inch seam allowance, and now I'm going to press that. You can press it either direction that your pattern calls for, to the right or to the left, and you can see all of your frayed edges of the fabric that might fray are neatly enclosed inside that seam, and the front you have a beautiful seam. So this is French seams. It's a really great, simple way to finish the seams of your project.